the good that God is working toward isn't simply relief from my hardship, but the renewal of all creation through people finding themselves in Christ, empowered by his Spirit to, get this, co-labor in that work, making all things new. Last week, we sang a song that had these lyrics: you make all things work together for my good. You make all things work together for my good. This is a quote from the book of Romans. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says this: we know that God works all things together for good for the ones who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. So there's a big question mark around what does all things mean? Well, I would say, in light of the things that were happening to God's people in Rome, when the book of Romans was written, all things can't just mean the inconveniences of my week. See, Paul is talking about the sweep of suffering and sin and death and decay. I think there's a temptation sometimes to even sing that song, right? God makes all things together for my good. It's really easy to read that like in a really flat or devotional way. Like, I had a really tough week. God's gonna put a bow on this later for me. This is how I'm gonna get through. I know that's a little demeaning in the way that came across, okay? But versions of that often play in our mind. And let me say, like, if you read the Bible and God brings you comfort like that through the Spirit, like, that's okay. But I want to also say that's not what it's about. What it is about is that God is at work in all these things. In the midst of suffering and pain, God is at work in all these things to bring about good, not just for isolated individuals, but for the community of those who love God and are called into God's purpose. See, the bend here is whether or not we want to have this conversation and read the Bible through an individualistic, my lens kind of view, or understand the Bible through a corporate view. Because when we read it individualistically, sometimes what happens is we begin to develop this, let's call it a theology, in the back of our mind that says, if I love God, my setbacks will eventually pay off for me. Until they don't. I'm not gonna ask you to raise your hands, but how many of us have that theology somewhere in the back of our heads or somewhere deep in our souls, right? That if I just loved God, or had I loved God more, this setback wouldn't have happened to me, or God would have fixed this, or this bad thing wouldn't have happened. Or if they just loved God, if they just loved God more, if they were just a part of our tribe and did it in our way and lived how we live, that bad thing wouldn't have happened to them. You make all things work together for my good. See the problems with it? When I think the story is that because God has bound himself to all of creation and to his people, that God has bound himself to creation and to his people, none of the suffering and chaos and futility of this world will thwart his purpose to renew all things in Christ. This is where we put our hope, that the work of God is a cosmic reality, and God has bound himself with us in the midst of that reality. That the comfort for me personally is not that my story always ends with a bow tied neatly, but that my struggles are woven into a much larger tapestry of God's redemption. See, the point is that the good that God is working toward isn't simply relief from my hardship, but the renewal of all creation through people finding themselves in Christ, empowered by his Spirit to, get this, co-labor in that work, making all things new. That's the hope and the comfort. You make all things work together for our good. It's not about you. It's not about you. But it's this bigger picture of how God is with us in the midst of our pain and our struggle. And when things in the natural don't make sense at all, when we read about another shooting, another war, another innocent person has died, another classroom, another school, another political violence, like another one and another one and another one. The hope we have is that God is somehow with us. And that Jesus says, live in my way. Trust your life into my truth. And in the midst of this pain, when everything around you is falling apart, you will be the people who can talk about the crack in the door, that little bit of light, that little bit of grass coming up through that barren soil. You'll be the kind of people who can see it when no one else can see it. When the rest of society is screaming at each other, above each other, and below each other, we'll be able to stand in the midst of that, to stand in the gap of people's pain. And not give them some shitty answer that God is making it's going to work out for you in the end. That's not the story. The story is so much bigger than that. It's that God is at work in the world. If you can hang on to him, if you can find some solace in hanging on in the ways and teachings of Jesus.